All right, we're diving back in with our foundational documents. We will be moving on from the Anti-Federalists to the Federalist rebuttal. So we're going to be moving from Brutus 1 to Federalist 51. So this is written by James Madison, and it's a response to his critics, to some of the critiques that the Anti-Federalists have levied against him in the proposed Constitution. Um, First and foremost, it does discuss checks and balances, holding the three branches accountable to the people, or the true source of power in Madison's mind. There's this wonderful quote: "In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and then in the next place oblige it to control itself." So this speaks to the idea of not only the people being the true source of power, but also the steps that the founders took in order to put checks and balances in the Constitution, to kind of bake that into the cake, so to speak, was necessary to protect the people, okay, to protect people's rights. Madison also discusses the way Republican government can serve as a check on the power of factions and the tyranny of the majority. He also utilizes this paper as a defense for the proposed system of federalism that the Constitution kind of lays out. So we'll touch those different pieces. But point number one, representative democracy. He goes on to make an argument here that is logical, but then he points out why it's wrong. Okay. So people are the true source of governmental power. Agreed. Three branches must be independent of one another, and it would be best if none of them had direct power over the other. In an ideal world, you wouldn't need three branches of government, but in a better world, the three branches wouldn't really have any interaction with one another. They would each have their separate powers, and they would pursue those powers independently of one another. They certainly wouldn't have any say in the makeup of the other branches. You would never have a president pick the Congress, or the judiciary pick Congress. They'd be independent in that way. And again, people would be the true source of power. It follows the reason that the people should pick the numerous legislatures, a single executive, and every judge. Okay. But that's wrong. Okay. Yes, people are the true source of power, but think about Fed 10. What do majority factions do to minority factions in pursuit of making their lives easier? The majority's lives easier, they're willing to limit the rights of the minority. So mob rule is not good. So having people have direct say in every branch of government probably isn't the best case. Okay, it's not practical. People could be convinced to elect someone who's ineffective at their job. That's the main point that Madison's making. But what he's really alluding to is mob rule. Okay, people having too much control is not a good thing. Therefore, direct election of everybody won't work. Okay, so this is his first argument that he makes, and you can see the way that Madison kind of thinks is he concedes points. Yes, people are the true source of governmental power. I agree with the Anti-Federalists on that. And ideally, the three branches would be independent of one another. I agree. That'd be great. Okay, but there's a limit to the trust that Madison has for people, and there's a limit to the trust that he has that anybody can do these jobs. Okay. So he's making an argument that people can't vote in directly all the different branches of government. Okay. Or he's alluding to that point. Okay. Point number two, checks and balances are necessary. Okay. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The executive's goal is, to assume a certain level of power. You have to give Congress the tools it needs to limit that. Okay. And vice versa, which we'll talk about that direct relationship or specific relationship in a second. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Government should be reflective of human nature. Men are not perfect. You also cannot expect men to act perfectly. So we have this faith, this argument that that power is derived from the people. Well, people can be bad. So in that case, you need to have controls, not only on the will of the people, okay, but also on that idea of how to get the government to limit itself, okay. That's why checks and balances are necessary. So how to check Congress. Madison really doesn't go too in depth now. This is the most he talks about Congress in regards to checking the powers of Congress. In Madison's mind, in the anti-federalist minds as well, if you go back to Brutus, Congress is the most dangerous branch, potentially the most dangerous branch of government. Okay. It's the easiest for power to kind of be assumed and abused. All right. So how do you check Congress? His first argument, and this is the one that you need to connect with Fed 51 and Madison in regards to what he thinks about Congress. The best way to stop Congress from amassing power is the bicameral legislature that they've designed. Okay. House direct vote based on population. It's the lower house. Okay. It's the direct voice of the people. Senator, state legislatures choose them. It's the upper house. Everybody's equal. The senatorial saucer, that idea that Washington put forward, that the ideas would be cooled in the Senate. Okay. The tempers of the House would be cooled in the Senate. That's the number one defense that Madison lays out, is the fact that you effectively split the potentially most dangerous branch into two, okay, sub branches. That's going to limit Congress's ability to abuse power. Okay, how to check the executive. Madison quickly moves on to discuss very briefly, kind of even at the close of his paragraph discussing the legislative branches, the executive branch, and really he argues that instead of limiting the power of the executive, the framers needed to actually bulk up the power of the executive, because one man standing against an entire branch, not only in the legislature but also in the judiciary, or branches I should say, is relatively weak. So they have to enhance the power of the executive in order to give that branch co-equal status. He doesn't go any further than that. It's just a brief line at the end. Okay. If you're wondering what Madison says about how to check the judiciary, he doesn't. He briefly talks about life appointments, but a lot of that's going to be handled by Hamilton, both in the executive, but also the judiciary in 70 and 78, which we'll look at future videos. Okay. Federalism. This is a big point that Madison makes in the second half of Fed 51. He refers to America as a compound republic. So that's that idea of federalism, because it's not only the republic or representatives from the citizens doing their job at the federal level, but also the state level. Okay. So you've divided power between two distinct governments, federal and state. Okay. And then you've allotted certain powers to each, and you've subdivided those. So we split the federal government into multiple branches, and each state gets their own government and can organize that into usually three branches: a state judiciary, a state executive, and a state legislature. Okay. And he goes on to say towards the end of that quote that if a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. Okay, so he's again speaking to this idea of dividing and dividing and dividing the government again and again and again as a form of fracturing the society in a healthy way, so that you don't have a majority faction. And I know factions are showing up again in Fed 51, but they do. Okay, and that is for the interests of everybody. It's for the interests of minority groups and majority groups. That no one group be able to amass power across those different levels of government, okay, state, local, state, federal, and across the different branches or subdivisions of each of those governments, okay? So federalism is an argument or is another example of Madison saying, here's another check and balance. We've split the government up. And that's an important principle to understand, is that federalism is perhaps the best check and balance against a overbearing or potentially overbearing federal authority. The last thing I wanted to do before we move on to kind of how this could be used in an FRQ, this more so than any other document, other foundational document, really connects to MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail. So I would definitely suggest you kind of read through this, these two quotes that I've selected. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. Paramount, most important, okay? Justice is at the end of government. It is the end of civil society. If someone's being denied justice, then they should pursue justice until they lose all their rights, because without justice, you don't really have any rights. And he also goes down towards the end of this paragraph. It's really sound reasoning, and it does sound very similar to what MLK said, which is that majority factions also should have an incentive to promote civil rights and equality among citizens, because they don't want to be subjugated by their government as well. Okay. So preserving people's liberties, preserving people's rights, that is the pursuit of good governance. That's what Madison is saying here. So how could I see this being used? My best guess. Checks and balances. This one speaks specifically about Congress, but alludes to general ideas of checks and balances and why they're necessary and important. Factions, again, anything dealing with majority minority factions. Madison makes another argument here on how best to control them. Federalism as a check and balance. That's a prominent point here that Madison makes. And lastly, towards the end, when he starts talking about civil society and civil rights and justice, justice, he doesn't go so far as to say civil disobedience, but you could see the implication of that in some of his comments towards the end of Fed 51. So take your time. Can you think of any more potential uses of the document? Let me know, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.